Okay, excellent. So I can see the chat now, so definitely feel free to interrupt at any point, and let me know if I can clarify anything, if you are curious about knowing more about any of the ideas I talk about, or just have a point that's cool that you want to make. So I'm going to be telling you about some of the recent directions in my lab. We're studying knitting primarily, and we're studying it in two main veins. We're studying it from the point of view of knot theory. So Shashank Markande, who was a former PhD student in my lab, who just graduated and is now at Penn working with Eleni and the soft matter group there, was the main knot theorist on this paper, in this work. And the other work is done by Mike Dmitriev, who was a postdoc in my lab and is now at UMass working with Greg Grayson, who was the computationalist, and then Krishma Singhal was the PhD student who fortunately is still in my lab. She's awesome, who has done the experiment and imaging. So we're basically looking at how the topology of knit structures gives rise to lots of interesting types of elastic behavior in knitted textiles. So our basic idea is that knitting is coding. So just at first glance, what you see is this is a close-up of, this is a shawl called the Dragon of Happiness. The pattern is by Sharon Linzauer. And this is a zoomed in portion of the chart that is given to create this section over here. So if you look really closely, there's a grid, and then there's all of these little teeny ASCII symbols in it. And those symbols code for specific topological manipulations of the yarn. And this is on a square lattice, but the symbols sometimes take up more than one grid space laterally or vertically. And the idea of textiles as being a source of sort of code isn't anything new. This is a picture of the jacquard loom, and this is arguably the first digital technology. So in a loom, basically what you're doing is you're choosing, does the yarn I'm passing through go over or under the strands that are currently there? And what happened before is that those sort of got pre-programmed in. So you could have maybe a couple of different choices and it would lift like every other strand all at once, or, you know, every third strand all at once, or even some pattern of those, but they would sort of happen together. And then you could maybe do a repeat of something like 8 different possible patterns. But what happened in the jacquard loom is that each crossing now becomes individually addressable. So you get to pick each crossing and say, is this an overcrossing or an undercrossing? And the way that they implemented that is using punch cards. So that is what you see here. And this is exactly the same punch cards that were used in the ENIAC era computers. So they could code systems into these textiles in the same way that you would be running code on some of the earliest computers. And here's a modern take on that. So in one sense, knitting is coding in the same way, but it's much more than a binary language. So, so as I said, the words in this structure, we can have words that are 1 pixel by 1 pixel, but we can also have words that stretch across many pixels laterally or many pixels vertically. So we have basically a combinatoric explosion of the way that knitting as a formal language can produce sentences or code. It's also true that sometimes things that you have done previously influence things that you can do later on, and that builds in the ability to think about things in terms of logic. So I'm going to start off by talking about what those words can be, what letters, what words, and we'll start off with the canonical knitting example. This is like the identity element almost, is what's called the knit stitch. And so what happens here is I have a needle in my right hand and a needle in my left hand. There is yarn that's attached to the right hand needle, and you can imagine this is infinitely far away or infinitely long. It can be attached to some point, but I can get it's sort of a source for as much yarn as I need. And to take a knit stitch, I put my right needle through the last loop on my left needle, and then I wrap the free yarn around it, and then basically pull a new loop through the loop on my left needle. So the whole process of knitting is just pulling loops through other loops. And it gets to be complicated loops through other complicated loops, but the basic idea is really you're pulling loops through loops. So here is something of a close-up version. So this is something you might think of as a unit cell for the knitted stitch. And I've got basically a whole fabric here that's made out of repeated knit stitches. And this fabric we call stockinette if you're a hand knitter. So stockinette comes from stocking. So it's the same fabric that you get in stockings. And if you take this fabric and you flip it over 180 degrees, you end up with basically the backside of this fabric. And so stitches that make up that backside are called purls, which are literally if you take a knit stitch and you rotate it 180 degrees about the vertical. So from the pulling loops through loops point of view, one case I'm pulling a loop from the back of the fabric through to the front, and the other case I'm pulling a loop from the front of the fabric through to the back. So they're really the same thing related by symmetry. So there's also a bunch of simple patterns that you see in a lot of textiles that are made from knits and purls. So alternating rows of knits and purls is something called garter stitch. And this is garter as in like a garter belt. So this has a different type of elasticity. So it sort of plays off of stockinette in the name comes from how it's used. Ribbing is alternating columns of knits and purls. And then seed stitch is this checkerboard lattice. So these are sort of topologically distinct, but the thing that's really interesting is that all of them have totally different elastic behaviors. So this is stockinette. If you do any sewing, this is called jersey. It is really common. I guarantee that everyone here is wearing something that's made out of this. This is socks, t-shirts, cardigans, hoodies, underwear. It's pretty much everything that's elastic, that's a piece of clothing, it is made out of this fabric. And the elasticity, try to get the light on this so you can see it a little better. The elasticity is an emergent property of this knit pattern. So the yarn itself is pretty inextensible and can pull on it. It doesn't really change length even when I pull very hard on it until it breaks. But the different fabrics are really quite stretchable. So this one is actually the stiffest of the fabrics. It tends to roll up at the boundary, so it kind of wants to be locally hyperbolic. I'm not going to get into that, but that's something that's quite interesting about it. Garter, which is the alternating rows of knits and purls, it's really stretchy in the vertical direction, and it's pretty stretchy in the horizontal direction. The rib stitch is incredibly stretchy in the horizontal direction. So this is used in places like cuffs and collars, places where you really want to have additional elasticity to your garment. It turns out that it's not very stretchy vertically, and this comes a bit from the fact that the columns are getting jammed together, but we haven't quite included that in our model yet. But that's, if you're interested in jamming, that is a thing that is relevant to this. So it's not very stretchy in the vertical direction, but it's almost an order of magnitude more stretchy in the horizontal direction than the other fabrics. And then seed stitch is sort of a mix of everything. Like it's pretty stretchy vertically, and it's pretty stretchy horizontally, but it's not going to sort of break any records in either case. So we're really interested in how the different types of stitch topology interact with one another to produce emergent yarn elasticity. Fabric elasticity. So we were also, before I get there, I will tell you a little bit about what can go into these boxes. So what stitches are allowed, what words are allowed. And to do that, we want to think a little bit about how can we formalize this in terms of knot theory. So normally, as physicists, we see something periodic and we say, okay, we'll put periodic boundary conditions on it. So I'm going to sort of glue up the sides and glue up the top and bottom. And that seems pretty reasonable. But when I do that, I seem to get two different things going on. So first, I'm going to wrap, what am I going to do? So this one, I'm going to connect the top and the bottom together going forwards, like sort of towards the front. So I'm going to sort of roll it up towards the viewer, and then I'm going to glue the left and the right sides around behind. And so here's a little video. So first I'm going to extend the edges so we can kind of see that this is in fact overlapping towards the front. And then the other part's going to go around behind. So this pretty much looks like an unknot. You can imagine I sort of grab the two elephant ears and untwist them, and then I can sort of contract this all into a loop. But if I glue this up in a slightly different way, so I'm going to take the top and the bottom and then glue them around behind the plane of the knit, and then I'm going to take the sides and glue them around behind that, I end up with this structure over here. So again, it's going to have the edges protrude first, so we can see that these are in fact wrapping around behind the structure. And then this is going to extend and wrap around behind that. And this, I think you can sort of stare at for long enough, and you can try to untangle these local neighborhoods here, and you'll find out that in fact you can't untangle this, and this is what's called a connect sum of two trefoil knots. So I've got one trefoil here and then one trefoil here, and they're glued together. So it turns out that I've done something a little bit wrong. So I've sort of mixed up the spaces that I'm gluing these things in. So I started off in this periodic space where I have left and right sides glued together, and I have some sort of front surface here and some sort of back surface behind it. But then I've kind of like filled those things in when I really shouldn't have. So what these things are, they really should live inside the glaze that's on the surface of a donut. These things really live inside this thickened torus, and that's the space that these live in. And it turns out that were I to consider that when I'm gluing these knots up, I actually end up with knots that are topologically identical. So what we can do if we want to study knots in S3, which is sort of the normal place where people study knots, is I can basically have this T2 cross I structure reproduced in S3, and I can do that by removing a hop link from it. So the hop link is this sort of linked combination of circles, and what happens is that if you imagine I remove the texture in red and the texture, or and the stuff in green. So imagine I put like a little worm inside the donut that ate all of the donut but none of the glaze, and then I had another worm that ate the rest of the universe outside this. I end up with a structure that's topologically identical to what's inside here. And so this is really the right space to look at this. So I can glue up my knot in exactly the same way. So here I have my boundaries identified. So green gets glued to green and pink gets glued to pink. And so I'm going to put this now into my space with the hop link. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of wrap the green sides around the green hop link component, and they get glued up like this. So now the green sides are identified, and I want to do the same thing with the red sides, where the red sides wrap around this red hop link component. And so first I'm going to sort of pull up the boundaries and then sort of wrap them all the way around behind. And I end up with this here. So now this is not a knot anymore, but this is a link, and this link lives in S3. So this is the place where normally we study knots. I can stick this into knot theory software like Snappy, and I can get calculations out from this. Basically, I still maintain the knit stitch look, and then I've got this huge gadget that kind of loops around it that's encoding something about the fact that now I'm in T2 cross I and not in S3 anymore. So we want to know what we can put inside this dotted line. So this is what Shashank has worked on. So he, I guess, had noticed that all of the knit stitches he had studied have this property that they're so-called ribbon. And ribbon is a property where if you imagine you take a knot and you dip it in a soap film, so basically the knot now is the boundary of a disc. The only singularities you can have are places where the disc passes completely through some other portion of the disc. So you're not allowed to have bits that sort of intersect in this X shape, like my hands are doing now. And so he had noticed this and had sort of pointed out, well, this looks like it's something that should be valid, but I don't know if this is knittable or not. And it turns out that knittable there's no mathematically precise definition for knittable, but I looked at this and I was like, I think I can knit this. So why don't you bring some knitting needles and yarn to a group meeting on Monday and we'll check it out. And so it turns out that I was able to knit this because I am a hand knitter. This is something that could never be done on a knitting machine. But hand knitting has a pretty large configuration space of possible manipulations I can do with, 10 fingers and 2 knitting needles. And so these are the little stitches here. They're the ones that have this little dollop on the sides, so I think this is really kind of wonderful that Shashank was able to look at the mathematical properties of these knittable knots and come up with something that the knitting world had never seen. And it's just using math. I think that's so cool. And so basically, we have been able to prove that all knittable stitches are ribbon, and the converse is not true. So all ribbon knots are not knittable stitches. I'm not going to get into those proofs here, but I will show you a brief construction of how we have come up with a class of thing, or we've come up with a structure which is called the swatch. And everything that is knittable is a swatch. As I said, knittable is not a well-defined term. There's sort of upper bounds on complexity that vary person to person. So it's not well-defined, but so this is a construction that if it is knittable, it will exist inside the swatch as a unit. So basically, this is what we call the unknit. It does have periodic boundary conditions. And how I start it off with M contractible loops. And I've sort of slid them past the lower boundary. So they're sort of glued up here. And then everything in gray, I've sort of just glued down. I've sort of just pasted this to the side of my, of this torus. And I've said, okay, I'm just gonna ignore that. And so I also have N longitudes. So each of these are longitudes on it. And now I'm allowed to do anything I want to this. I'm allowed to make any Rittmeister move, any ambient isotopy is a valid thing I can do on any of these loops. So I can do, so Rittmeister ones are just sort of this loop on loop process, like those Dumbo ears. I can slide 2 pieces of yarn past each other, and I can slide a 3rd piece of yarn past the intersection of 2 pieces of yarn. So those are the sort of 3 Rittmeister moves. These are classes of ambient isotopies that you can have in this type of planar projection of knots. I'm allowed to do that. And then at the end of the day, I do what's called band surgery from bits of loop up here to these frozen bits of my initial contractible loops. So what band surgery is imagine I have these 2 knots over here, and I'm gonna put these little rectangles on them. So initially, the top and the bottom of this rectangle, or the top and the bottom of this rectangle, are part of my knot, and the horizontal pieces aren't. And then in band surgery, basically, I just swap them. So I make the sides part of my knot, and then the top and bottom not part of my knot. And this is what that structure looks like post band surgery. So now I've connected the 2 knots this way. So I'm gonna do that process here. And so this is what I get after that. And this is my swatch. And the upshot of this definition of swatch is that it doesn't mean that everything has to be based on a single loop picture, the way I had shown it before. We can have all of these constructions that depend on sort of rectangular blocks of manipulations of knits and of the loops in my knitting. So this is a basket weave stitch. So this clearly doesn't, this isn't something that acts on only a single loop. This is me taking two loops and swapping them either this way or this way. And cabling over here is an even more complicated version of that, where I'm taking groups of stitches and reordering them in a braid. So that's something that we can do with this swatch technology. But I guess I will spend the rest of the time talking about the ideas of emergent elasticity. So why it was that the four swatches, the four samples I showed you at the beginning, behave in totally different ways, despite the fact that they're all knits and purls. And the latter three are all 50% knits and 50% purls, just in different patterns. So we've done a combination of experiments and simulations to understand this. So this is our knitting machine, and this is Krishma making a sample. We have recently acquired a really fancy computerized knitting machine, but we still need technicians to come out and get it all set up for us. This will enable us to study way more complicated samples than Krishna can make on this little manual desktop machine. And then from that, we've done stress strain analyses here. And so what Krishna does is she puts an array of pins in the textile, just the heads of pins, so they don't really affect anything, but they're something that the camera can pick up, and then uses those to back out the full nonlinear strain tensor. And so Mike has done some simulations based on these ideas. Basically what he's done is he's split up the knit stitch into two regions. So there's regions where yarn wraps around other pieces of yarn. So basically like my fingers linked together like this. So the places where they're touching, we call crossovers. And then there's free strands of yarn that connect those two regions. And then he puts this in a box with periodic boundary conditions and says the total length of the yarn is fixed. And then we use a really simple Elastica model for the energy of the yarn. Basically, we only consider curvature energy. We can consider torsion, but it's in spun yarn, the bending modulus is a lot greater than the torsional rigidity of it. So we can basically ignore that component. This gets to be more complicated if you deal with like monofilament, which it seems like a lot of physicists do, but the resulting textiles, you really need to have more turns in your elasticity to be able to completely model them compared with spun textiles. So basically after that, he has a yarn-yarn interaction energy. So this comes from measurements we do on the yarn itself. So he just feeds in the bending rigidity and the compressibility of the yarn from experiments. And then basically does the same thing that Krishna does by applying forces. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say, well, let me just go back. So basically he applies forces to either side of the simulation box, and then lets the box change size depending on the energy minimization of the yarn inside it, subject to the constraint that the total yarn length doesn't change. Okay, so we've decided to use Bezier curves to divide up our model rather than bead spring models. And I think this is really nice because this gives you a polynomial approximation to your curve. You're no longer stuck with something that's discrete. I can add in more and more terms and see how these converge to different solutions. And there's a really nice geometric interpretation of what Bezier curves are. So this is a third order Bezier curve here. And so you have 4 parameters for it. So the first two are, sorry, the first and last one are the start and stop point in R3 of your curve. Then you have a vector that connects K0 to K1, and that is the tangent vector to your curve at the starting point. And then the vector that connects K2 to K3 is your tangent vector to the curve at the end point. And higher order ones would be curvature and derivatives of curvature, and so on and so forth. So basically, we have all of these Bezier curves, and you connect up Bezier curves in crossover regions to Bezier curves in connection regions so that the start and end points are the same, the tangents are the same, the curvatures are the same, and so on. So these are the simulation results. So if I looked at a photo of this compared with a picture of, those photos of the yarn samples I held up, with the right textures, they look pretty much the same, but that doesn't really tell us anything about their behavior. So we do these uniaxial force analysis on this as well. And this is the full result we get. And this is a really complicated plot, so I'm gonna take a little bit of time to walk you through it. So on the right side of the plot, what I'm looking at is when I apply a force in the XY direction, what the strain response is in the XY direction. This bit over here is the strain response. Sorry, this is the XX direction. This is the YY direction. So the left side is the strain response in the Y direction. And each of the 4 fabric types is color coded. So green is rib, purple is seed, garter is orange, and stockinette is blue. Then we have closed symbols. So those are the experimental data. The open symbols are the simulation data, and both of those are fit to a nonlinear constitutive model. So we end up with a couple of regimes. So we end up with a linear regime, and then that transitions into a strain stiffening regime. So we're mostly going to be focusing on the linear regime down here, which is where we believe topology controls our results. So I have the same plots for forces in the YY direction. Oh, I should point out that rib is by far the softest, and stockinette is the stiffest in the horizontal strain experiments. In the vertical experiments, we have garter and seed together being approximately the softest, and stockinette being by far the stiffest. So this kind of meets our expectations, sort of when I was pulling them for you, that goes along with this. And we wanted to understand why it is that we see these differences. And it turns out that we can sort of look at the symmetries between knits and pearls and knits as a way of understanding this. So here is, this is a stockinette picture. This is the X direction here. And so I've got a knit stitch here and a knit stitch here, and they're joined together by this U-shaped region. So this is a curve that has even symmetry. There's a total length of these stitches in the x direction, which is lambda naught, and then the total yarn length, LU. So we want to apply some force to the end and extend it a little bit, keeping LU fixed. And we want to see what happens so that we can take lambda naught to lambda naught plus delta lambda. And so when we do that, we end up with a stiffness that goes like 180 times a bunch of constants. And the constants don't really matter, and I'll tell you why in a sec. And we want to compare that to joining a knit with a purl. And so these would have odd symmetry. So we have, I guess, our purl down here and our knit up here. And so this forms sort of an S-shaped curve. We've got some total length of the curve and some lateral extension of the curve. And then what happens here is that there's actually a mode that lets us extend lambda naught without introducing much, if any, energy into the rest of the piece. And that's merely by rotating it. So I can sort of take these points and rigidly rotate them a little bit, and that's going to extend lambda naught, but not really change the elasticity of this region. And so this is what that looks like after extension. So here we are introducing a little bit of curvature because we've constrained ourselves so that the tangent vector is the same between the two. And so here we end up with a stiffness that is basically 12 times the same constant. So this is 15 times softer than this is over here. So then there's one extra term that's of interest, which is this term here, which is saying that the initial starting angle, so what this phi is, matters. So if I'm vertical, it costs me no additional energy pretty much to have a rotation. But if I'm horizontal, it's basically an infinite energy because I can't extend the yarn. So from this is what we get for each of the different yarn pieces. So stockinette is even for both of them. So it's obviously the stiffest. Garter is even in the X direction and then odd in the Y direction. And that kind of makes sense because this is the softest in the Y direction along with seed. And then rib is definitely the softest in the X direction. And even though it has odd symmetry and seed has odd symmetry, we can kind of look at the slope of these pieces to see why this one's so much softer. So these are nearly vertical, where these are getting a little bit beyond 45 degrees. So we can see where the difference in those strains comes, in those stiffnesses comes from. So I guess I should say we've done these experiments with multiple yarn types, and we can renormalize them. So we do end up with basically the same behavior across the different yarns. I guess the last thing I was going to say is how we get our constitutive model. So the first is just to note that as we apply a force to the boundaries, we end up with concentrating the curvature into these crossover regions, whereas we sort of have an even distribution of curvature when there's no force applied. Under high force, we get these sort of peaks where all of the curvature is concentrated in these regions. So from that idea, we can introduce a bending length to this. So that's just dimensional analysis is the square root of bending rigidity divided by yarn tension. So for low tension, we've got a large bending length. And for high tension, we have a low bending length. And so we can kind of use this in an elastica model to say that if we increase, if we have, this is the length end to end, and the total length L is constant. If we increase the end to end length, keeping the tangent vectors fixed, we end up with an energy that goes like 1 over 1 minus R over L. So this diverges when L is equal to R, where you can't extend it anymore. So that's sort of the basis for the nonlinear part of our rigidity. And then we have a linear portion, which comes from the symmetry and topology of the stitches. So basically our constitutive model is the linear piece plus a nonlinear piece here. And that is enough for us to fit the fabric to this complete nonlinear strain tensor. So this is work in progress, but this is a finite element simulation with this nonlinear constitutive model and comparing it to the equivalent experiment. And so this is what the simulation looks like compared with the experiment, which I don't yet have a video for. So going forward, we're interested in what happens when we violate the square lattice assumption, where we introduce defects into the underlying lattice. So we have the idea of dislocations, where I've sort of added in additional bits of yarn to some places, and then disclinations, where I've allowed my yarn orientation to rotate around a point. And so this will let us study both in plane and out of plane deformations. So here, those nice rows of V's are now these meandering lines, and I have these out of plane deformations with the head of this bunny. So with that, thank you so much.